Boris Johnson has made a plea to parents to send their children back to school, saying it is vitally important and that their life chances are at stake if they do not return to the classroom.
Well, it comes after the UK's 4 chief medical officers say the risk to children is exceptionally small. But opposition MPs say the back-to-school message has been undermined by the exams fiasco.
Yeah, joining us to discuss this is Shadow Health Secretary Kate Green and Chair of the Education Select Committee, Robert HALFON. Thanks for joining us, both of you, on the show this morning. Let's come to you first, Robert HALFON. I mean, why are we a sort of week before, the schools are opening, at least in England and Wales, and still in this situation where there's tremendous uncertainty and parents are still asking themselves, asking each other, are we sending the kids back to school next week?
Well, in my view, this is possibly the most important issue facing our nation. We've had millions of children not learning during the lockdown, millions of children with very little contact with teachers. We've got safeguarding issues, a potential epidemic of education poverty. We've got a digital divide with hundreds of thousands of kids not having computers at home. So whatever happens, we do need to get our children back to school. Of course, we're in a national pandemic and people are concerned, but I've been campaigning for a long time for children to go back to school. And I really welcome what the chief medical officers have said, that actually the risks staying at home, the risks to mental health, safeguarding their educational life chances are much greater than the minimal risks, thank goodness, of children getting the coronavirus. So we have to do everything possible to get our children back to school next week.
Kate Green, let me bring you in. I think we queued you up as the Shadow Health Secretary, Shadow Education Secretary, of course. But Kate Green, Labour obviously would agree that that children need to go back to school. But again, I think we've asked you before, and I ask again, what would the Labour Party have done differently? What are those specific things that we haven't seen already that you would have done differently in order to make it safer?
It's essential children go back to school, and for exactly the reasons that Robert describes, their well-being, their learning and their long-term life opportunities. But really, in terms of making preparations for their return, while head teachers, principals and school staff have been working really hard over the last few weeks, the summer holidays, to make the schools safe, I think the government has been missing in action, to be quite honest. The guidance that's been given to schools is one size fits all. It doesn't take account of the fact that a small school, perhaps in very constrained premises, will have to make different arrangements from a large inner city school. There hasn't been information for school leaders so that they can't plan what they might have to do if there was a sudden spike in the local infection rate. And the guidance that has come out, I think, it's been contradictory, it's been confusing. It came very late, shortly before the summer holidays. So I think better support for schools would have made the lives of staff much, much easier. And of course, over the last couple of weeks, as you've said, we wouldn't have been in quite the position we're in if the government hadn't had to waste time sorting out its exams fiasco.
Robert HALFON, coming to you on that. I mean, do you think that's a justified criticism there, that, the government's obviously been busy sorting out the exams fiasco? Perhaps they could have given a bit more tailored advice to schools rather than this one-size-fits-all. And Kate Green was making the point, what happens if there is a spike? What happens in a school if there is a case?
Well, the first thing I'd say, of course, you can always argue that clarification and communication should be better. But there are pages and pages and pages of guidance on the Department for Education website for schools in terms of how to open the classrooms and how to deal with, God forbid, if they do have a coronavirus rise or in the schools. And the thing I would say to the Labour Party, they have a historic relationship with the trade unions. We have to get our children back to school, and what the Labour Party should be doing is encouraging the trade unions as much as possible to help get the children back to school rather than put obstacles in the way. And trade unions are tabled, nearly 200 questions they want answered. I mean, if we had this, they're imposing conditions that no other workplace is asking for. And if we'd had that, we probably wouldn't have, in every other workplace, we probably wouldn't have had supermarkets open. And the question we've got to ask is, why is it that it's okay for children and parents to go to restaurants, to go to Primark every day, but the unions don't feel that it's right for them to go to back to school. And I think this is so important. It is not party political. The Labour Party should use its historic relationship with the trade unions to persuade them to do everything possible to get our schools open again.
Kate Green, I'll let you come back on that. Are the trade unions doing their job, or are they just putting obstacles in the way here?
The union leaders I'm talking to all the time are as desperate as anyone to see children back in class. They're education professionals, they're teachers. They really care as much as anybody about children's futures. And it isn't the responsibility of the trade unions, ultimately, to get children into the classroom. The government has to make the conditions suitable and safe for schools, for staff, for students. And it's been asleep at the wheel. It's been not paying the attention that schools need to the details of how they're going to reopen, nor has it been out sending a strong and clear message to parents. I do agree that it's really important that we get everyone back into school next week. And I, like Robert, really welcome the clarity of the Chief Medical Officer's advice, which I hope will bring reassurance to parents. It is very important that we're all speaking positively and constructively about the real benefits for children of being in school. And I know that teachers, head teachers, trade union members are all very much looking forward to welcoming them back to class next week.
But Kate Green, I mean, you voicing doubts and the unions raising issues, doesn't that then put doubts in parents' minds as a consequence? Robert Halfon's making the point that there are pages of guidance that the government has made available for schools which should cover any scenarios.
Well, I don't know if the guidance does cover any scenario, and it's quite lengthy and contradictory at times. So the volume of guidance isn't the only issue. But I think what is very important is that parents do feel confident, as they should, that school is a safe place for their child to be. It's a particularly safe place, as Robert was saying, for the most disadvantaged children. But it's also the responsibility of government ministers to ensure that school continues to be the safest possible place and give all the support that they can to school leaders and school staff so that they can welcome children back into school and get on with their job of educating them and looking out for their emotional well-being.
I mean, Robert Halfon, Kate Green was talking about the Education Department being asleep at the wheel. Did we have an issue initially, do you think, about schools being closed? Did they need to be closed? Should we have got pupils back sooner in the first place? Because we were looking at a situation, aren't we, where, theme parks were opening, pubs were opening, and yet we couldn't manage to get children back to schools, which we're hearing should have been a priority.
Well, I would have liked schools to have remained open as much as possible. In fact, we should remember that they were open for children of critical workers and vulnerable children, although now we know that 85% of vulnerable children did not go to school. It is easy to look at these things with hindsight when we were at the height of the pandemic, but what should have happened, despite the individual efforts of many teachers and many wonderful schools, the fact is that we know that over 2 million children did hardly anything during the lockdown. And if there are local lockdowns, or God forbid we're in a big second wave, there has to be national guidance in terms of the hours that children are learning. There has to be a guarantee of SIM cards and computers for those kids who don't, possibly by just giving teachers vouchers to go to Curry's. And I'd like to see a more proactive role for Ofsted, not as necessarily inspecting, but at least as a candid friend, working with the schools on safeguarding issues, leading the advice, and so that whatever happens, whether at home or at school, the children are learning. But in the meantime, now we just have to all come together and get our children back to school. There is nothing more important. We are damaging the life chances of a generation of young people. We've got to get them back on the ladder of opportunity. We've got to deal with real issues like attainment, which could be as wide as 75% between disadvantaged pupils and the better off students. And that is a potential disaster in the making. So whatever happens in September, we need to get the kids back to school again.